I think the Eastern Cape gave you an award for your contribution to culture.
Definitely. Yeah, and promotion of culture and heritage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we appreciate you. Thank you for taking the time to be here.
Appreciate it.
So why do you do the work you do then?
It goes back 30 years when I was a student at the University of Water. I was angry about the way in which history was taught at the time because they put more emphasis on memorization and regurgitation. It's unlike other subjects I did at the time, like English, that was taught by Professor Mzamane, where he encouraged us to think, to be critical, to ask questions, and he would talk about liberation of the African mind. Now you go to history, it's dull. It's good content at times, but you can't ask a question. So there's an incident I even talked about in my book. We're sitting here in a class, and the lecturer is talking about the good role played by missionaries in Southern Africa. So I then lifted up my head and says, "Sir, I hear you, but what about the assertion made by Bishop Siqebo Dwan?" And then I quoted one saying, "The post-missionary Christianity in Africa, with its links with colonialism, capitalism, and the abstract proclamation of the gospel, has created a deep cultural confusion and left a permanent scar on the souls of the African people." Unquote. So then the lecturer was a white Afrikaner. He removed his glasses, walked around. It was dead quiet in the classroom. And then he asked me a question, says, "Is that a question or a comment?" And I had to read between the lines that if I say it's a question, I may lose the course because it's tantamount to a challenge. If I say it's a comment, probably he will proceed to the lectures if nothing has happened. And my reading was right. So I said, "No, sir, it's a comment." And he proceeded. To cut the long story short, I passed history because I majored in English, history, and education. But the subject I really wanted to proceed was history. After that, I gave up on it. So my master's, I did education, PhD, sociology. Now, about 30 years later, I decided to revisit the subject. So that's why I decided to write that book, Triangle of 100 Years Wars, and which turned out actually in the context of the Eastern Cape. The first African to write history of the Eastern Cape was Henderson Soga in 1930. In 93 years, no one has written a history of the Eastern Cape from the African perspective. The only people who contributed was Professor Perez in 1976. In the 1990s, then it was Professor Tim Stapleton and Noor Mostad. By three. But the first one was the African in 1930. So my book is the second book to be written by an African in 93 years. And my book is the first book which is written with a very strong assertions, which says that Nongqawuse was a colonial construct.
What?
Yes.
Are you saying?
Yeah, I said that in my book. I made that discovery to say the whole story that we learned all these years, to say Abantu Abamnyama African killed their cattle. It's not true. And
what is the story?
Remember when we grew up from this book, before I wrote the book, all we knew was AmaXhosa became victims of their own creation. That was a colonial construct. They killed their own cattle. They went into starvation. Population was reduced. Then they were saved by the white colonialist.
Yes, that is because they were non-believers and believers.
Yeah. So what what's said about Nongqawuse is that the people who came after that, the products of missionary schools, even went further. Now I'm talking about.
You've jumped, Doctor.
Yeah, now I'm talking about people who are.
But we still don't know the Nongqawuse story.
I'm coming to that.
Oh, okay.
So the people who wrote about Nongqawuse are saying, I'm talking about now the African reverend. Nongqawuse actually, it's a good thing it happened that they killed their cattle because it was a form of spiritual redemption. So what I discovered, I went back to research. Remember, history has got 2 layers. My book in history is regarded as a secondary source because I wrote based on other sources.
Yes.
But if you want to be a true historian, you should go beyond the secondary sources to look at primary sources. So what I did in my case, then I went to read eyewitness accounts of people who were there at that time. That's what I did, looking at primary sources, looking at people who wrote about that period, 1856 and 1857. So what I discovered was that actually, when Sir George Grey landed here in December 1854, few months after his arrival, there was a mysterious cat lung sickness which started killing the cattle of Amaxhosa. And the funny thing is that it targeted only Amaxhosa. It didn't affect Abatembu, it didn't affect Amampondo, it didn't affect Amampondomise. This lung sickness targeted the people who were fighting these 100 years wars. So the disease started spreading around 1855. Then at the beginning of 1856, Amaxhosa discovered the pattern of the disease, that it had 2 characteristics. 1, it was highly contagious. 2, it was very lethal. So they started killing the infected cattle in 1856 and 1857. But unfortunately, it was rather too late. That disease decimated about 90% of the cattle of Amaxhosa.
Oh my God.
Which therefore makes me to conclude that actually Eastern Cape was never conquered in the battlefield. It was through the introduction of the British biological weapon of cattle destruction. That's how conquest was attained.
What do you mean? You have to explain that to us.
What I'm trying to mean is that in history, they are saying when the British came here, they fought with us, they defeated us, they took the country. It may have happened in other parts of the world or other parts of the continent, but not in the Eastern Cape. In the Eastern Cape, when Nongqawuse came in 1854, it was after the British were defeated by Amaxhosa in 3 consecutive wars. The first defeat was in 1835, after the British killed King Ginza. Maqoma avenged that defeat. Then he challenged the British to the mountains of Amatola to say, "You kill our king? Come on, bring it on." So the British army was led by the Peninsular War veteran, Major General Harry Smith, hailed as the hero of Alwal. So he was accompanied by the governor of the Cape Colony at that time, Sir Benjamin Durban. So they crossed the Kai River to meet Maqoma in the mountains of Matol. That encounter was disastrous for the British Army. The British Army was defeated for the first time in Africa by Maqoma in 1835. The defeat was so humiliating that Major General Harry Smith was fired, was sent to India to redeem his military career. Sir Benjamin Durban exiled himself in Canada. The white Boers who were in that part of the colony since 1652, for the first time after 1835, they embarked on the Great Trek and crossed the Orange River and established what they used to call Transvaal and Orange Free State after the defeat by Amaxhosa in 1835. Then the British tried again in 1846 to send the Knight of Hanover, Major General John Hare. He was the distinguished Napoleonic War veteran. He had 4 divisions. It was the British mounted soldiers, the Boer infantry, the Khoisan snipers, and the Mamfeng auxiliaries. Then he marched into Kaiskamahoek. Remember, Kaiskamahoek was the heartland of the resistance of Amaxhosa. That's where they waged the wars, because the place is mountainous. So they went there for the second time, now led by Major General John Hare. King Sandile was waiting. He retaliated. Historians are saying the power and the precision of that overwhelming attack Sandile launched dismantled the core of the British Army. General John Hare was not fired. He resigned, collapsed, and later lost his life from heart attack. The third defeat of the British was the War of Mlanje in 1850. It started on the 24th of December 1850, when Lieutenant Colonel George Mackinnon faced a crushing defeat on what we call today Sandile Dam in Kaiskamahoek, defeated by Sandile. And that war went on for 2.5 years in Mount Misery. So Sir George Grey, when he came in 1854, he was the first governor to be an educated man, to be a civilian. All along, the British, since 1805, brought military governors. But after the third defeat, they brought a civilian governor. It tells you that there was a change of policy.
Yeah.
Then the civilian governor then was accompanied by this surreptitious, mysterious cattle lung sickness.
What?
So that's what then my book says.
What a big lie.
It is.
That has lasted centuries and centuries.
Yes, resistant one.
Even Tatu Zexum Da's got a book called The Heart of Redness based on that, saying the old, the fake story, basically.
Yes. People believed it. Because if you look at my argument, it's logical. There was no way Amaxhosa would have killed their cattle. Do you know that in the olden days, Umxhosa would have 500 cattle? He knows them by names. When he goes to the forest, he doesn't push them behind. He walks, they follow him. When he goes back in the sunset at 6 o'clock, he stands on a mountain. He calls them by names, and they follow him back home. Amaxhosa were cats were not, cows were more than pets to them. Remember, to Amaxhosa, the cattle were the representation of the past, the present, and the future. Yes, to Amaxhosa. Because they believe that as Mnandingu Jongi, I inherited these cattle from my father, who got them from the great-grandfather. So these cattle have been here for centuries. We come and live, these cattle are here. That's why Amaxhosa, to show that how important cattle were, when Makoma went to circumcision school, guess what happened? They gave him an ox called Jingle. On that ox, he established his nation called Amajinga. That's how important cattle were. Amambalu were named after Mbalu, the name of an ox. If you hear amakwati, when you talk about amakwati, bethetha ngesithakazelo bathi inkomo zikaJojo, zikaXesibe, zikaMchuchumbe. Zinkomo ezo. Because they built nations using the names of the... And inkomo were not slaughtered for food by Amaxhosa. If they need meat, they go and hunt meat. So you tell me that people came and killed their cattle because of a